Welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to have this discussion today on the gender impact of or trade relations, especially with Latin American countries and the case of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. I will present you our different speakers in a minute. I want to let you know that there is interpretation in English, Spanish and Portuguese, so that this meeting is as inclusive as possible and that you can follow our exchanges in your own language, and you can also speak in your own language, of course. So thanks to the interpreters to be with us today. Why is this webinar important now? Because of the recent election of Lula, of course, becoming the new president of Brazil in January, and we really much welcome it, of course, but it also opens a new way for the EU-Mercosur trade agreement to be rediscussed. And so we all know that the fate of the Amazon forest is crucial. And that is why so far European officials have worked on a specific document to limit the risks of the deal in terms of further deforestation, jeopardizing the climate change and aggravating biodiversity loss. And this attempt is, of course, very important, considering the climate emergency. And I don't have to remind you that we are in the middle of the Conference of the Parties on Climate, and that there is soon also a Conference of Parties on Biodiversity in Montreal. But having said this, I can't but underline that this agreement also raises other concerns, many other concerns. But one is especially preoccupying us today. And when I read the sustainability impact assessment of the agreement that should have underpinned the deal, I was shocked by the warning issued page 168, mentioning potential adverse impacts of the trade deal on women. Let me quote some elements of the impact assessment: the risks to women's economic independence, women risk being replaced by men because of technological upgrading, and potential consequences for growing gender income disparities. So I was surprised, really surprised, that nobody ever raised that gender issue. Not even during the Gender Equality Week we just had in the European Parliament. And it is really questioning, since the EU has adopted a gender action plan, making the promotion of gender equality a priority, including in its foreign relations, external policies and actions, and claiming that we need to accelerate the process on empowering women and girls. And in a report that we have adopted earlier this year on this action plan, the European Parliament reiterated a very old request dating back at least 2018, that the Commission effectively includes gender equality in all trade and sustainable development chapters, designs dedicated gender chapter, and ensures that trade and investment do not exacerbate gender inequality. And as a Green feminist MEP, and also an MEP in charge with gender mainstreaming of our international trade relations inside our INTA committee in charge of international trade, I'm really happy that we have this discussion today, and that it can open new ways of including this dimension effectively in our trade relations. So I'm really grateful that our panelists accepted this invitation to talk. And to begin with, I will give the floor to Carolina Pavese, who dived into the text of the FTA to find provisions related to gender. And you will answer the question, are these provisions shaped so as to entail concrete, meaningful actions? Then we'll hear from Marta Reis Castillo. You will present your findings as to the evolution of jobs. You conducted what I would call a gender impact assessment of the EU-Mercosur FTA with respect to the labor market in Brazil. And your report vindicates that the gender dimension should definitely be ramped up in the agreement if it were to ever come into force. Then our third speaker will be Dorotea Lopez Giral, and you will compare the situation with the EU-Chile FTA. It has not been signed off yet, but it contains an ad hoc gender dimension and gender articles. The question is, could it be a source of inspiration to fix the EU-Mercosur deal? And finally, we will hear from Esther Nieto Hernandez, your Deputy Head of Latin America Unit at DG Trade, and we'll ask you to react, to comment on those presentations. So thank you once again for being with us, and without further ado, let me introduce Carolina to you. Carolina Pavese, you're Assistant Professor in International Relations at the ESPM Escola Superior de Propaganda y Marketing in Sao Paulo. You are coordinator of the Center for European Studies and Business at the school, and you were recently awarded a Jean Monnet Chair under the last Erasmus Plus call. And so you will talk about the gender impact of interregional trade and specifically the case of the EU-Mercosur deal. You have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Saskia, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here in a panel set up by women, organized by men, but with women as protagonists. So this is a change, though the topic begs for women as speakers. And I would like to thank for this invitation and congratulate you and Olivier for organizing this very important webinar under this topic that, as you mentioned, has been terribly neglected in the discussions we've had of the EU-Mercosur agreement throughout the more of 20 years that have followed the starting of the negotiations into the conclusion and the signing of the agreement. So I hope that now, if we pick up the ratification process again, we will be able to put gender at the center of the discussion, and you're giving a very important contribution in this direction. So I was assigned a task to discuss the institutional dimension of the EU trade agreement and gender, and I have a PowerPoint presentation which I'm going to share with you right now. So just a second. Hope you can all see it. Yes. Okay, so let's start. Before entering the key components of the EU-Mercosur agreement, I would like to start with some key assumptions that we have to take into account. So as you're familiar, in 2019, the EU and Mercosur signed up this association agreement that entails trade provisions and trade liberalization provisions. So that's very likely to have unavoidable impacts in overall trade policies and the structure of domestic economies. And my colleague Marta will talk to you more about the impacts on the labor market. So I'm very happy that she will be following with that discussion. So in order to analyze the gender dimension of trade, we have to consider that given that economic and trade activities impact society differently, they reinforce or undermine existing structures of inequalities across different social and regions, social groups and regions, and this includes women. So even if trade liberalization in itself does not create gender inequality, it might create conditions that can either enhance women's economic situation or exacerbate their pre-existing gender inequalities and bias. So the effects of trade liberalizations on gender inequality derive from uneven access to capital and properties, labor markets, earnings, human capital, and correlated public policies, cultural bias, and gender norms. They also vary across markets and within different social and economic groups. And another important element here, when we're addressing gender inequality and especially the impact of trade agreements in women, we have to take into account that women should not be dealt as a homogeneous concept. We are not a single entity. Rather, it's crucial that when we talk about gender, we adopt an intersectional approach. And this would entail taking into consideration difference in terms of age, religion, ethnicity, cultural background, ableism, and education, race. So all these elements that will influence the opportunities and the obstacles that we women in our plurality face in society in integrating into economic, political, and social activities in general. So that's my first starting point. So how has gender inequality been incorporated in trade agreements? A study that was published last year by the World Trade Organization analyzed the evolution of the inclusion of gender-related provisions in RTAs, so regional trade agreements, and we can see that they have increased steadily since the Beijing Declaration, and with an input more of the Buenos Aires Declaration of the WTO in 2016 that stresses gender. So we saw a surge in that number, and by December 2020, 83 out of 577 agreements, RTA agreements that were notified to the WTO included an explicit gender-related provisions. Even this mean good news, the number is still very low in comparison to the overall number of notifications, and there are examples of backlashes. So between 2015 and 2020, nearly 25% of global economies reduced the number of gender-related provisions in their new agreements. In practice, most RTAs seek to promote cooperation by adopting a very soft rules, such as exchanging best practice and etc. And in this sense, according to the ITTC, there are some obstacles to doing further inclusion of gender provisions in trade agreements. The first one would be the lack of awareness, and the second, insufficient political will, that both reflect the misperception of trade as a gender-neutral issue and the low priority given to gender equality by policymakers. Consequently, there is an absence of expertise on gender issues within governmental bodies to engage in trade negotiations. And combined, the lack of prioritization and expertise often leads to the scarcity of gender disaggregated data, which is crucial to supply information on the potential impacts of an agreement on gender equality. So where can we talk about Mercosur and the EU? So entering the domain of the agreement, empirical evidence shows that gender inequality is a social structural component of both the EU and Mercosur. Women do not have fully equality in different degrees in both regions, and economic empowerment is an obstacle to reaching parity. Female employment rate varies significantly in the EU, but is still higher than Mercosur's average. In both markets, as you can see here in the graph, services are the sectors in which women participate the most. In Europe, industry is the second largest employment sectors, whereas for Mercosur, agriculture is the second most sector in which women concentrate. So Saskia was mentioning about the impact on agriculture, and then we can see here that in the case of Mercosur, this is one of the factors that contributes to a greater impact. Crossing the information on female participation in the labor market with the sectors impacted by the agreement, it is undeniable that the association agreement between the EU and Mercosur is likely to affect women. The impact assessment report calls for the recognition that there is a latent risk that the agreement in some respects will accentuate inequality in the Mercosur countries, especially affecting women who work in the agricultural sector or are in conditions of greater informality or with lower income. And I have to stress that informality is great in Latin America and in Mercosur, especially with Paraguay, for instance, having more than 70% of women that take part in economic activities and paid economic activities being in the informal sector, and this was significantly increased by the effects of the pandemic. So despite the acknowledged and the clear evidence that there is an impact, how does the agreement addresses gender inequality? And we have a spoiler in the answer, which is that it fails to account for its effects on gender in its current structure. So looking at the body and the text of the agreement, as it is structured in terms of 3 pillars, when we look at the first pillar of the agreement, there is one mention to gender equality that states that the parties share the objective to jointly promote gender equality, respect for the rights of all women and girls, with an emphasis on the gender perspective, and to address discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation following the internal legislation of each country. This is a very broad overall statement. And when we dig in the cooperation pillar, so the second pillar of the association agreement, then we have more mentions to gender equality. And here I quote one of them. So in the section dedicated to cooperation on democratic principles, human rights, and the rule of law, international peace and security, there's one specific item dedicated to gender equality, peace, and security. So here we're going to have a few more mentions. Yet the chapter or the pillar that interests us is the trade one, and there's only 2 explicit mentions to gender, both in the trade and development chapter that was incorporated in the body of the agreement at a late stage of negotiations. So Article 4 will mention that the parties agree to develop international trade to promote decent work for all, including women and young people. And Article 13 states that the parties will seek the interrelationship between skills development and gender equality. So the trade pillar will only make these 2 explicit mentions to gender, which is very concerning. And even if the inclusion of gender across these different areas, so in the political dialogue element of the agreement, in the cooperation pillar and the trade pillar are somehow interesting, we shouldn't get too enthusiastic about them because they address these issues very shallowly. So as an overall assessment, looking at the body of the agreement and what has been discussed so far, we can conclude that it does not adopt a comprehensive institutional framework for gender mainstreaming. The negotiation process and its outcomes thus far neglect the importance of effectively addressing gender. Neither one of the 3 pillars establish instruments and strategies to promote the objectives outlined to advance women's rights effectively. They're just a statement of goodwill's intention here, but without teeth or without clear mechanisms on how to actually deliver these goals. There's no mention of eventually existing bilateral regional arrangements on this agenda that could be applied to cover the gap left by the agreement. And it also does not mention a gender-balanced decision-making process, nor a civil society organizations led by women in implementing and monitoring the deal, which is crucial if we want to adopt a gender mainstreaming approach to this agreement. So considering the structural roots of gender inequality, the omission of a sound gender approach to trade cooperation is not surprising, but is equally worrisome. And the lack of an appropriate approach to gender mainstream in the EU Association Agreement poses a potential threat to economic gender equality in both regions. But to conclude on an optimistic note, there are some measures that can still be adopted to ensure a gender mainstreaming, namely the preparation of impact assessment to guide the implementation of the agreement. So we've had a few studies that were the Commission prepared, and unfortunately we don't have access or we don't have information if Mercosur has ever conducted any kind of similar study, so an impact assessment, and this has not been, this has been done, it's not being made public. The development of an adoption of coherent policy and institutional framework for gender mainstreaming. We should also emphasize the importance of prioritizing the collection of sex disaggregated data. It's very difficult to find this kind of information, especially when we want to enter the specific activities within each sector. We can adopt strategies to support activities of independent women's leadership and professional organizations, and conduct research on women's in small micro-business enterprise, and improve human resources development of female working force. Also, in the absence of gender-related provisions in the agreement, the parties could incorporate gender equality measures to their national trade policies and domestic implementation instruments for the agreement. So this would be more individual strategies and measures adopted. And now that we might resume the ratification process, this process can lead to amendments to these gaps. And in that case, the EU-Mercosur agreement could still create incentives for equalities, given a relevant contribution to narrowing the gender gap in the regions. But whether the parties will seize the opportunity and close this gap, this remains an open question. So that's what I had. For now, I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for this overall mitigated, I would say, assessment, but also for the recommendations and the perspectives you give in order to improve the deal, because that's also why we're here, to try to find ways to improve it. And we see there's still room. And of course, you mentioned it, we'll need a lot of political will to take that direction. I will now ask Marta Reis Castillo to intervene. You're associate professor at the Institute of Economics of the Federal University of Rio. You are deputy director of graduate studies and coordinate the Industry and Competitiveness Group. You also editor of the Journal of Contemporary Economics, and you will talk about the impacts of the Mercosur European Union Agreement on women employment in Brazil. You have the floor, Marta.
Bom dia, hello. I think I'm going to speak in Portuguese to be more direct. And but the slides are both in English and Portuguese to ease the access of the results. Well, first, it's a great pleasure to discuss this issue among such a qualified group from to be present at this this call from the Green Group by the means of Saskia. It's a necessary issue to be discussed, and I'm going to, well, first, thanks for all organization, Carolina, for this excellent presentation. That's a very good introduction for the specific issue I'm going to abord. Well, this is a work that I developed with Kathleen Ferreira for a Instituto Equit e la Rete de Comércio e Gênero from Latin America that have been working on impacts of trade agreements and other issues on labor market and for women and other subjects also. Well, então vou passar agora para o português.
Okay, so now I'm going to shift to Portuguese. So the results that I'm going to present here concern a specific subject that intends to illustrate the importance and the different dimensions that need to be considered when we discuss a trade agreement, such a trade agreement of such proportions. And I would like to start by mentioning something that Carolina said, that there is no neutrality in economy or in international trade. And it doesn't exist because the roles of women and men in labor markets, both paid and unpaid, or if we want to call it productive and non-productive work or labor, they are different. But when it comes to trade, this is a two-way relationship, as trade can strengthen or weaken some structures or inequalities. The existence of the inequality can also be the origin of the explanation of competitiveness or of trade specialization of some countries. And it's important if we want to think about whether there is interest or not in promoting gender equality. So economy and international trade are gender carriers. They carry in themselves these issues connected to the agenda, the gender agenda. So when we think about the impacts of trade, of international trade and international trade agreements for women, we can think about different dimensions. We can think about what happens to consumption, because trade can change the conditions to access goods and services. We can think about how international trade affects poverty and inequality. But the main theme that is more visible and more explored, therefore, is the fact that trade affects the lives of women through the world of work. We always need to remember, of course, and this is more and more introduced in literature, but still there's not enough work studies dealing with this, because there are the two different dimensions. We have paid or productive work, but there's also reproductive or unpaid work, and there are not enough studies in on the second type. And sometimes so this is not in the sphere of the trade pillar, so to speak. And there are different ways in which this can be affected, especially when it comes to services and other areas that may affect this reproductive or unpaid work. And so we're going to deal here, we're going to talk about an analysis on the effects on productive work, paid work, and Brazilian paid work market. Of course, we can extrapolate a bit, but there are some singularities in Brazil because of its trade partners. But I think that there are some items that deserve our attention because they are relevant in this discussion. This discussion that aims at perfecting this agreement. So the agreement was signed in very specific conditions, and actually it surprised us because it solved some conflict between Europe and Mercosur that had existed for 20 years. And and we know that didn't happen by chance. It happened because there was a convergence of interests between the right-wing governments in Mercosur, that we still have one that still is in office, but it's about to end his administration. So the agreement was signed. I say this because this led to a different that there is a resistance to opening up agricultural sector to Mercosur, resistance to granting greater access to its market for industrial products and services. So what I'm going to go back to this when I talk about the perspective for women's jobs, because I'm talking here specifically about tariff issues and also government procurement and intellectual property. Everybody knows that, but I have to mention that there is also a relevant aspect that needs to be pointed out, which namely the trade specialization of both groups in the north and south. Brazil-EU trade is north-south. Brazil exports low sophisticated products and imports goods with greater technological content. Again, this will show when we talk about jobs. Because what we want to do is not only quantify jobs that can be threatened or generated by the agreement, but we also want to see what jobs are these, and we want to assess the quality of these jobs. So we're going to estimate the volume of jobs that are associated with trade. And this is something that is very well consolidated in this economic area, which is the calculation of trade employment content. And here we consider that jobs associated with exports, they are generated by the agreement, and the jobs that are associated with or contained in imports are jobs that are potentially threatened by imports. Why? Because when you import goods, you are not manufacturing these goods domestically, and you wouldn't generate these jobs. You wouldn't create these jobs. If you think dynamically in the increase of imports, you are potentially destroying jobs. And this is a very simple exercise. Oftentimes, economics complicates things, but it's a very simple exercise. And we need to pay attention to this exercise. It is very well, it's a consolidated methodology in economics. So on the quality of jobs, we use this employment quality indicator that brings together 4 characteristics of the labor market: remuneration, formality, female participation in management position, and the duration of contracts. And in this sense, we calculate this indicator, bringing together these 4 dimensions, and we calculate it for men, women, and according to each sector, using data from social research here in Brazil. So the best jobs, the higher quality jobs would be in sectors with better salaries, with higher formality rates, where women occupy increasing shares of leadership positions, and whose turnover is not very high. These would be the best jobs. For you to have an idea, I want to show you the results as to the number of jobs. This is for 2018, Brazil, of a total of 104.3 million workers, 43.7% were women. Of this total amount here, a part is associated to exports. This part is 12.4 million jobs that are direct and indirect jobs associated to exports, which is a relatively low percentage, but it's nothing new, because large countries tend to have large domestic market, and jobs that are directed to the domestic market are more important. Of these 12.4 million jobs, 2 million are jobs associated to exports to the EU. Here, the percentage of jobs for women is smaller than for the economy as a whole, and it represents 29.6% as compared to 70.4% for men. So jobs associated to export to the EU are mainly male. When it comes to imports, it's only 9.5 million jobs that are associated to imports. And when it comes to the EU, 2.5 million are from the EU. So if in general trade, exports generate more jobs, they threaten when it comes to the trade between Brazil and EU. There is the opposite. More jobs are threatened than generated. When it comes to imports, 39.9% are jobs for women, and we see that there is actually a negative balance. The number of threatened jobs threatened by the agreement is larger than the number of jobs created by exports. These are 2018 data. So this is more important for women than for men. And this reflects the composition of the market, which I'm not going to go into detail, but I think that I summarized it at the beginning when I talked about the differences in the specialization of the two groups, of the two blocks. And this is very important. It's more important on the side of the imports by Brazil. But what's also important here is that in general, in exports, both for goods and services, these are less sophisticated than the services that are imported, goods and services that are imported.
And it also, this poses a direct impact of the positioning of Brazil in the international trade. When you are trading in higher sophisticated sectors, you also promote and create better quality jobs, and therefore it impacts the population and the labor market accordingly. And this is what it's called the regressive specialization of the country, because if Brazil is specialized in low sophisticated goods and services, it has a backwards effect as well. The results found on job quality are as follows. So you can see the employment quality indicator. We have aggregate data shown here in the charts. And if you wish, we can go into more detail during the Q&A rounds and the specifics of each indicator. But I would like to call your attention to the following points. Firstly, when we draw a comparison between men and women, we see that the total employment for men has a much better quality indicator performance. And it is true also not only for total employment in Brazil, but also in the export sector. Apologies, in the case of imports. So as you can see in the first column, you see a better performance for employment quality for the total of the economy, and also with jobs associated with imports from the EU. In the case of exports, even though female workers have a lower participation, they also do not have such a strong weight in terms of quality of employment. So in the imports, you see a much better employment quality. And this is true for women and men. However, there's a point of concern. There's a difference between the data, but the total exports do not differ as much for the exports targeted at the European Union, but it does exist a large difference between the indicators between imports and exports to the European Union. Therefore, in terms of the trade agreement, we can see that the increased trade between EU and Brazil would definitely pose a threat for the quality of employment of women in Brazil. So in conclusion, in view of all the data I have presented to you from the studies, we can think of a number of issues that arise from the trade agreement between Mercosur and the EU. Of course, this is a static exercise. We've analyzed data for 2018, but it can generate some extrapolations, and it is also compatible with other different studies that employ different methodologies, including the impact assessment from 2019. And what draws our attention in terms of consequences for women is that this regressive specialization of the Brazilian economy would be exacerbated in the relationship with the European Union. Brazil, even more than the other partners of Mercosur, have different patterns of specialization when you take the trade relations with China, European Union, and US. So there are different economic profiles associated with the trade of each bloc. And again, what we can expect in the EU-Mercosur agreement is a north-south specialization, as we have seen in other agreements. This sort of specialization, of economic specialization, for each country or for each bloc is associated with the generation of lower quality jobs, is also connected with the potential elimination of jobs in the industry and in services. And because imports from the EU have this potential of reducing economic activity in these sectors in Brazil and Mercosur. And this would impact both women and women.
Marta, I'm sorry to interrupt, but in order to have enough time for the next speakers, I'll ask you to wrap up, please. Thanks.
Apologies, I'll wrap up. So sorry, should I wrap up or just stop? Yes, you have taken 22 minutes already of the schedule. Okay, I'll just conclude. I think the main points have been raised. We need to think of the impacts of the existing economic specialization in the bloc and their impacts in the labor market. So apologies for the delay, and I give the floor to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, but it's true that we have to stick on the timing to enable the whole discussion and the exchanges afterwards. But it's very striking that you're providing such findings and on the impact of on jobs that are more threatened than created in trade with the European Union. I will now give the floor to Dorotea Lopez-Giral, Director of the Institute for International Studies at the University of Chile. You're an economist and spent the first part of your career in native country, Mexico, working for the Bank of Mexico and the Ministry of Commerce and Industrial Development while teaching at the same time. And you settled in Chile in '98, where since then you're working on trade and international economics, if I'm right. I will ask you to give us a perspective of the EU-Chile Free Trade Agreement, which is containing gender provisions. Dorotea, you have the floor.
For recommend me and to Oliver for organizing, and it's a pleasure to be with Marta and Esther and Carol in this panel, to be with such an experts and with all the public listening, and thanks to the Parliament to listen to us, to the academics and the academics from Latin American countries. I think it's very important to have these kind of discussions between us, and as Carolina said, between women in the panel. It's difficult to say something new after Carol and Marta that make such great presentations, but I will refer just to the case of Chile. And I want to establish that I don't want to be an inspiration from anyone. I just want to tell you about our chapter in gender in the modernization agreement between UE and Chile. And I'm going to switch as Marta to Spanish to be clearer, but I'm really thankful for the invitation. I want to share my presentation. Aclaro que nosotros...
And I would like to clarify.
Oops, sorry, just let us...
Sorry, just a technical issue. 1 second.
I don't know what's going on with my PowerPoint. Can you see it? No. Are you able to see it? Perfect. Full screen. There we are. Full screen. Muchas gracias. Entonces yo solamente...
Thank you very much. And
quiero contarles...
I would like to mention...
I would like to take out so sorry, I have the English and I cannot take it out. I have to stop my presentation.
Madam, you need to speak on the floor. Just choose the floor, the languages, and speak on the floor.
I wanted to mention that in Chile, nowadays we don't want to be an example. Nowadays we have a important point in our trade agreements, and we're in a process of questioning, analyzing of a trade policy that we've had very open, and there has been clear and dark points. Our policy is a total policy, and sometimes we had some issues, as Carolina was mentioning, and we were our expectations were very high, and we thought that they will solve any problem. And as we all know, the economy is much more integral. And this started with a mandate of Michelle Bachelet, where we had a transversal problem on the resolution of UN females, on the empowerment and the necessity of strengthening the human capital and the access opportunities to markets. And for Chile, that was very relevant, since it was one of the countries with more agreements and openness in the region. In 2015, Bachelet proposed the creation of the technical group on gender and trade on the Pacific Alliance with Chile, Mexico, and Colombia, and also in ACMED, where we've been working on the roadmap to get to 2016, as you know, to the first TLC with a specific chapter on trade and gender. We had previously some trade agreements with Vietnam, and we were mentioning the gender, but not so specifically. We didn't have a specific chapter on gender and trade as we have now. In the same way, we've been working on the implementation of a feminist international policy with a trans-cutting look, and the intention of including the trade and investment to be better embedded, as Carolina and Marta mentioned. And the trade has an impact, and that impact has to be assessed as well, and has to be part of a more complex strategies that an agreement could solve. Chile has been using different tools. Within the tools that we have, the creation of data, as Carolina was mentioning, the relevance in terms of the implementation of public policies, which is very relevant. Since 2017, we have a policy on women, where we can create the assessment that Marta was mentioning. We can monitor the women to see where they work, where are the impacts they have, where do they import or export as SMEs. We have different programs on the exports for women, how women export, such as Brazil has. And in the light of these agreements, we can create these trade promotion agreements to see what are the specificities for females when we try to export products. We have different measures for facilitation of the gender focus. We have an institutionalization very late, 2016, where we create the Department of Gender on the Directorate of Trade in Chile. And nowadays is the inclusive directorate, including the gender, trade, and indigenous people, and the different table that we will mention later on to compare it with the agreement on the EU. The first agreement was Chile, Uruguay in 2016, then Chile, Canada with the last update, and then Chile, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, which is not yet current, Chile, Paraguay, and Chile, Ecuador. where we have this kind of chapters. The assessment of the trade respectively to the gender and trade chapters are very different. I would say they're very positive, and they highlight the importance of the gender aspects, and they open the eyes to the gender issues. We have to remember that labor and environment topics were very shyly included as well, such as the gender, such as the case for gender today. They define different policies, and we can share policies that are more advanced or that are more focused on the equality for women and men. Define different cooperation schemes that, for example, today we have a trade with Canada, and it's very specific regarding the resources, the activities, indicators that are focused on the inclusion of women. We have a committee of gender and trade to monitor precisely the implementation of the chapter, and we can comprehend this nexus of trade and gender. And that we have to do as countries is to maximize the opportunities and reduce the negative impacts on females on trade. Negative aspects, well, agreements generally create more disputes, and they're outside of the resolution of conflicts. Somehow we believe we are less important than any other topic, because it's not included in the trade and gender issues, and the implementation is just on a voluntary basis. There is not a specific focus, such as the case with the Canada, and nowadays we created programs with specific data and indicators. The focus is very much highlighted on the economic empowerment, such as Marta mentioned, to understand the impact on exports and imports, and female have different roles in economy, and they should be monitored. Carol mentioned as well, we need more participation of female organizations and gender-specific organizations on the agreements and the economic relations. We need more harmonization of the legislation linked to gender, such as the agreements with the EU, or where the standards are higher than ours. And another criticize is that there is no language specific to taxes and related to women, and that's why the agreements on Chile have been progressing in this way. In our case, we didn't have a chapter, but nowadays we do have a chapter with a prior assessments carried out by the European Union. Our evaluation was a bit weak, and it wasn't as deep as the carried out by the European Union, but we see a positive balance, and they will say that they will increase the job for men and women, and we will see if the gap will increase as well. And in reality, they have the role as women as a worker, as a trader, and as a high positions in the organization. We will not enter into detail. We have the information on the screen, but we see that women work mainly on the agriculture sector. And in general, we see in labor markets that this effect is much more positive for men than for women. However, the assessment doesn't come from the other side as consumers, the mortality index and the role of women regarding exports, depending on the quality of jobs. And I think it's a very relevant issue, as Marta mentioned. The agreement in general are constructed with this logic. And I would say the agreement with the European Union is much more elaborated with a very binding language, concrete actions than what we had priorly with Uruguay or Canada regarding modernization. And in this sense, the first article is the objectives and the perspective. This is the context and the objectives regarding the importance and the growth and the development and what the female could achieve. We have an acknowledgement of the ODS 5, more specifically, regarding gender, and the Buenos Aires Declaration, the Human Rights Declaration, the Beijing Declaration, and the declaration of the WTO. This sector is being called to be accountable because we have a very important accountability regarding the results on the private sector, and it calls for a higher accountability and to make public the gender policies, so they have to justify regarding these activities, and defines actions, cooperation, and dialogue. With the European Union, they have different aspects, and we have different strategies. There is an acknowledgement as well to multilateral agreements such as the CEDAW and IOLI.
There are general provisions, for example, we reserve the right to establish strategies. There is a call for data constantly. Who preceded me made that very clear. Data, sharing, generating, creating data, helping us in that sense. The cooperation agreement is well defined in terms of this, and I'm going to show you what we have with Canada for you to see how you can share best practices, train women so that these high skill, low skill effects have less impacts on women. They need to cooperate with different projects, the WTO, the OECD, the ILO, the financial inclusion of women that was detected as one of the great barriers for women to take part in trade benefits, as well as education and digital education that's highlighted in this agreement, the participation of women in STEM, and the creation of networks among them. As I was saying, this is important for the private sector. We need to analyze the equity and work-life balances for women, because this will reduce the pay gap and share data. There's something which is really important here that has an equity between men and women, which is hard to find. We should never derogate laws in favor of trade and investment that could have a negative impact on women. This in relation to institutions, this is a more broad chapter, which is the sustainable development chapter, where both gender and trade are together. And in relation to settlement of disputes, unlike other agreements Chile has, where you settle a dispute and you're hopeful that this chapter will not be applied to the dispute settlement. Here, there's a different text on language altogether. There's an intention to make reference to the Sustainable Development Committee. The Sustainable Development Committee has at least one call for consultation and an expert panel. So we can see a change in the language that we have. As I was saying, it is very important to see what we have in the implementation of the chapters. Sometimes the chapters are a bit polemic, and we are now with a PPT. It seems that this is going to save us or affect it, either we sign it or not, and we are going to become a new country. So it's amazing. And then we forget about that. No one cares. that usually happens because no one takes care of the implementation of this chapter. So with Canada, we were working together and we created this work plan, which is a work plan that regularly updates and that tries to have gender balance, accountability, transparency, etc. But what defines the plan, and I would like to mention this, in order to have it clear, we already start requesting indicators, results, and an activity that, while it has to do more with training now, they start to have a different effect in terms of the implementation of the treaty.
I'm sorry, Dorothea, can I give you one more minute and ask you to conclude soon? Thank you.
In relation to the recommendations, I think that here we need to have a more comprehensive look. We need to understand that the gender and trade policies go through many stages. There are resources, and we need to have a higher participation of the social and civil society in this aspect. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry to pressure you, and it's really interesting, and I think maybe we can share slides and send them, if you agree, to the participants, because it's very interesting also to hear about the recommendations you have to make based on the good practices, both in the EU-Chile FTA, even though we hear that it's probably not perfect and that there is also room for improvement, but also to draw the lessons out of it for other trade agreements. I will now ask Esther Nieto Hernandez from the unit, Latin America unit of DG Trade, to react to what you've heard, maybe bring also perspectives, how hopeful can we be to renegotiate and to have further discussions on the EU-Mercosur deal when it comes to gender-related aspects. Estelle, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I feel the pressure of time on me, but I hope you know, to be able to cover quite a number of things. Well, first of all, of course, thank you for inviting the Commission DigiTrade to today's discussion, which I found very interesting already. And indeed, please share the slides. I think there will be quite a number of people on my side very interested in having a look at those. So also always very humble to be in a panel surrounded by academics, so bear with me on that. So in terms of, if you allow me, just as a way of introduction, I just want to frame a bit what's the Commission approach in this area, and then dive a bit more on the Mercosur side. I mean, in terms of promoting gender equality and women's economic empowerment, this remains a priority for the Commission and for EU trade policy in particular. And the way we do this is threefold, of course, and we'll talk about it through our own free trade agreements, unilaterally through the generalized scheme of preference, so the GSP, and multilaterally, for instance, in the WTO or in the International Labour Organization. So first, under the GSP, of course, we have to monitor the respect by the beneficiary countries for the principles of core international commitments on promoting women's rights and gender equality. In terms of the WTO, of course, you've probably seen that. I mean, the EU has been a strong proponent and actually co-sponsor the 2017 Buenos Aires Joint Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. We're very much engaged now in its implementation. And building on that, we have been a member of the informal working group on trade and gender in WTO since it was created, I believe, in the fall of 2020. So in this context, we actually, and just wanted to point this as a matter of information for those that follow these issues, we have recently launched a project with the International Trade Center, which looks at applying a gender lens to the work of the WTO. So there's been some seminars, I think in October and November, on issues such as trade facilitation, e-commerce, public procurement. And I understand that the International Trade Center will prepare a short, still this month of December, with conclusions on how to advance the gender perspective in the WTO context. So I close the brackets there. So the third pillar, of course, of our approach on trade and gender relates to what we do in our bilateral FTAs policy. And I think, obviously, integrating the gender dimension into the US trade policy is one of our priorities. I mean, I think you will know, trade benefits should benefit all, men and women, consumer, workers, and business of all sizes. I think that's the mantra that we've put forward since a few years, and certainly we've been working to ensure we success in that. And on that, we have engaged in recent years in reflections about how to best approach this in the area of gender. And certainly, as one of you pointed out, we have seen a gradual increase of attention to gender-related provisions and the integration and mainstreaming of gender considerations into our negotiations and thus our FTAs. So I just wanted to refer to two very important policy documents, one being the EU Trade Policy Review Communication of February 2021, which already underlined the importance of developing a better understanding of the gender equality implications of various parts of trade policy to inform our actions for improved gender awareness on policy. And it also raised, how to work in the framework of the WTO. And very recently in June this year, we published a communication to enhance the contribution of trade agreements to promoting climate, environment, and labor rights worldwide, and there you include gender. And some of the objectives would be to improve the way we work with our partners to promote sustainability in a way that is targeted to their needs, but also that covers all the different angles of sustainability, including gender and women's considerations. And also about how to strengthen implementation, how to be more effective, bring more effective enforcement, etc. Coming back to what we are doing in our FTAs, I think you probably will, and you make reference in this presentations, in all recent EU FTAs, you will see provisions on trade and gender regarding the relevant UN and ILO conventions advancing women's economic empowerment and gender equality. So ILO conventions 100 and 111, and of course on the promotion of cooperation in international fora such as the WTO. In terms of how what have been our policy considerations on how to best approach, I think we continue to reflect on how we can best use the provisions on trade and gender in ways that are seen as credible and that create synergies with other parts of the agreements. So not as a dedicated consideration, but really how we can integrate those considerations in a, I would say, cross-cutting manner. So there's been a back and forth, a lot of internal discussions, and I think of course, Chile is an example of one way we have tried to think about moving forward in this area. But I think from that experience and from a recent experience in other agreements, I think we believe that the best way forward should be to have dedicated articles on trade and gender to be inserted into our own TSD chapters. So in the trade and sustainable development chapters. And this is, for instance, if you look at what we have recently concluded with New Zealand, we have 2 pages of gender-related provisions within the TSD chapter, and we have followed a very similar approach in our proposals to India, which is initially reinitiated the discussions. I think it's very important for you to think when you're thinking about this is that obviously from our perspective, we think that it is key that those provisions are subject to the dedicated TSD dispute settlement mechanism. And they are subject also to the domestic advisory groups structure on equal footing as other TSD topics. And finally, because I don't want to take a lot of the time before getting to Mercosur, one area of work that is something forgotten, but I think today's discussion certainly has put on the spotlight, relates to the need to fill the existing data gap. I think it is an area that we already highlighted in the trade policy review. And if you look on this, all our sustainable impact assessment, as well as the ex-ante exposed evaluations, which we carry out by Digitrade with the support of external consultants, contain dedicated gender analysis covering both gender equality, but also women's rights. And in the field of trade, this analysis will cover typically women as workers, but also women as entrepreneurs and traders, but also women as consumers. So I think as one of you mentioned the fact that we had to take also into consideration these different angles in our assessments. Going back to Mercosur, I mean, I think you've been referencing that. Indeed, the sustainable impact assessment looked into the impact on gender and came with the conclusion that women were estimated to benefit from the agreement. However, and here's where I agree with intervenants, as women are underrepresented in tradable sectors and increases in agriculture and industrial exports may result in technical upgrading, women are expected to benefit from employment and income gains less than men. So, and women's labor market participation is lower, as you pointed out, and they're more likely to participate in vulnerable employment and therefore less likely to reap the financial benefits of any of the sectoral trade increases. I think the SIA in any case identify a number of sectors where there were in any case opportunities, such for example in education. And but what I think, and I don't think there's been any reference in today's discussion, is that the consultants, so those that actually drafted the sustainability impact assessment, came up with some recommendations about how to do what to do about it. And those recommendations were, I gather, recommended or addressed to Mercosur countries. And some examples were, about investment or increasing of investment in rural development programs in support of female farms. Another example, and increase on in capacity building and training programs across sectors, and also, of course, also to provide further resources for campaigns for fighting domestic violence, also a bit less of out of the trade sphere. And just to respond, if you allow me, before I finish, to some of the interventions, also to point out that I don't think we should be only looking at the text of the agreement itself. I think it's very important also to have in mind what is the institutional setup and the opportunities that institutional setup brings, but also to the implementation itself of our agreements. I mean, I will refer here to the role of the TSD committees in all our agreements to monitor the implementation of commitments, but also the possibility for that committee to make recommendations to the joint committee to address certain areas and to deepen the engagement and the cooperation in certain areas. For instance, if you look at the agreement that we have with Canada, the EU-Canada agreement, CETA, just very at the beginning of the implementation phase, the TSD committee recommended the joint committee to adopt a specific recommendation on gender, which it did. And that recommendation includes a number of roadmaps and very specific actions to follow through and to specifically address the question of gender and within that agreement. Also, Mercosur will have a domestic advisory group covering all the agreements. And this will also be a way for civil society groups, which including women-led organizations, to have a say about the actual implementation. And if you step out of the agreements themselves, there we have a lot of, they provide platforms to step up cooperation work in a number of areas. And we have examples in Latin America of projects also financed by the EU that have been particularly tailored to work on these issues, regardless of whatever provisions were in a given FTA. So I just want to close because I'm conscious of the time. Again, thank you very much for the webinar, and of course, happy to continue the discussion with all of you.
Thank you, Esther. And it's certainly not an easy position you're in because we've heard about the previous panelists quite critical, especially about the EU-Mercosur agreement. And I have to say, and this is also why we want to work on this issue more effectively on existing trade agreements and negotiated ones. Because we will not be satisfied with additional protocol on climate or deforestation. I think there are more issues, and unfortunately not only related to gender, but also to the TSD review the EU recently adopted, and which is absolutely not in line with the EU-Mercosur agreement. And gender issues are way too neglected, I would say, in the TSD so far. So we need a specific gender approach also in existing and negotiated agreements. But I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to work on it more effectively and to see how the talks, the new discussions with the new government and Lula's government will go. And I encourage you reach out to your colleagues also, because you presented us, and I'm really much hopeful that gender perspectives will become a real concern in our trade relations and included with effective means. But the latest implementation report on the common commercial policy doesn't mention gender at all. And so I hear from the Commission all the time a very strong commitment to include gender issues, but how come gender is still absent in many reports, many impact assessments, and even not to mention that the impact assessment on the EU-Mercosur agreement arrived after the negotiations. So there's still work to be done, and you're conscious of it. I know it, but nevertheless, we have to do better. To do better, I invite Inma, my colleague, Inma Rodriguez Pinheiro, from the S&D group. Inma, with me in Parliament, is gender mainstreaming. She has a gender mainstreaming hat in the INTA committee, International Trade Committee. Inma, we don't see you. If you want to open your camera and take the floor for a minute, if you can do that, so we can maybe have one or two questions from the participants as well. Inma, you have the floor.
Hola Saskia, muchísimas gracias. Creo, ¿me oyes? Sí, no consigo ponerme la cámara. ¿No me veis o sí me veis? ¿Me veis?
No se ve.
Un momento, estamos intentando resolver el tema de la imagen. ¿Dónde está? Aquí está. No.
Dale settings.
Video.
We can hear you. You can already talk if you wish. And...
Vale. Ahora. ¿No? ¿Me veis? ¿Me veis ahora?
No, still not.
Bueno, voy a intentar hablar mientras me intentan arreglar lo de la cámara. Bueno, lo primero es agradecer mucho a Saskia que haya organizado este importante y necesario intercambio de puntos de vista, y a todas las expertas que han intervenido, y también a la representante de la comisión, a Esther. Y yo me quiero tome muy en serio la incorporación de la perspectiva de género en los acuerdos comerciales, y no como una hermana menor a nivel de disposiciones. Nosotros, el Parlamento Europeo, ha aprobado sendas resoluciones, tanto en la legislatura anterior como en esta, por una amplísima mayoría, en la que el Parlamento pide que se incorporen los capítulos de género en los acuerdos comerciales, en los que se están en negociación y en los ya negociados. Lógicamente tiene que haber un orden de prioridades, pero yo no entiendo cómo después de tener estas resoluciones aprobadas, después de los evidencia de que la política comercial no es neutral, porque eso ha sido lo que se ha creído durante muchos años, y especialmente bajo las direcciones generales de la Organización Mundial del Comercio, siempre en manos de hombres. Ahora, afortunadamente, tenemos una mujer que está firmemente convencida de lo importante que es la perspectiva de género en la política comercial, y cómo el comercio puede ayudar a que las mujeres se incorporen y a través de eso se combata la pobreza y se mejore la posición de las personas en donde viven, ¿no? Entonces, desde este punto de vista, ¿por qué hay esa reticencia a que se le dé al género la importancia que tiene? Que es un capítulo con todo lo que se debe de incorporar para que realmente se tengan en cuenta todas las necesidades que tenemos que hacer para que de verdad los beneficios del comercio afecten por igual a los hombres y mujeres. Sabemos que esto no es así, y hay diferentes estudios que así lo demuestran, ¿no? Decía Esther de la Comisión, con razón, que Chile es un ejemplo, pero no es la única manera. ¿Cuál es la otra? Disposiciones a un rango inferior que un capítulo. Las pequeñas y medianas empresas pueden tener un capítulo específico, pero las mujeres no. O sea, ¿cuáles son las razones que de verdad llevan a la Comisión a considerar que no es necesario que haya un capítulo de género en los acuerdos comerciales? ¿Y cuál sería el mecanismo para, en todos aquellos acuerdos comerciales que existen y que están ya en vigor y con un orden de priorización podamos incorporar los mecanismos necesarios para ayudar a que la perspectiva de género sea una realidad para que se beneficien las mujeres del comercio. Lo dejo aquí y le doy de nuevo las gracias a mi colega Saskia, que está haciendo un trabajo excelente. Yo me sentía bastante sola en la legislatura anterior con el tema del trabajo para empujar que el comercio y el género fueran de la mano, y la verdad es que con Saskia y otras muchas Saskias que tenemos, algún hombre, poquitos, pero alguno también, pues creo que estamos empujando desde el Parlamento, pero necesitamos que la Comisión acepte el empuje y vuele con nosotros. Gracias.
Thanks, Inma. I fully agree with you. And we see it's a cross-party issue because you're in charge of gender mainstreaming. I am Helmut Scholz for the left and Samira Rafaela is also really much working on gender-related issues when it comes to trade for the Renew Group. So we have many committed MEPs, but still not enough. Still not enough to make it a stronger basis. I think there's already a question for Esther. There's a second one in the Q&A session, which I will read out from Gea Meyers. How can CEDAW be used in dispute settlement, given its more weaker legal base compared to ILO conventions? Would it not be very difficult for women's rights CSOs to come with what the European Commission consider as useful recommendations through DAX? So this is a question for you, Esther. This is a second question, probably more for Dorothea. What are the benefits of a separate joint gender and trade committee like with Chile negotiation? That is not part of EU-Mercosur and also not of the recent concluded one with New Zealand. It's both for the Commission and maybe, Dorothea, if you have an answer to that, please feel free to come in as well. Maybe I'll give first the floor to Esther for a very short answer because we're slightly running out of time, and then Dorothea.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And indeed, Saskia and Inma, I mean, certainly we hear you, and it's certainly why I made reference to the fact that there's been a lot of internal discussions and certainly consideration of what is the best approach. And I think we're learning by doing in a number of times, certainly. And if you talk to the colleagues dealing with TSD, and I'm not one of them, so just to be clear, certainly will tell you that the Chile case was one of the pilot projects for us also to see what would it be to have a specific chapter, you know, gender chapter in an FTA. So, and how to bring those considerations in a chapter. So, and I think, you know, and you've probably heard that this from my master, let's put it this way. So our Director Generals, I mean, and that the inclusion of gender provisions it's important, but for us, form should follow function. So we, in the fact that we should not be fixated about having a dedicated chapter if the provisions in the TSD chapter or across the FTA can also help. So that's where we are in terms of that consideration, and that after the experience with Chile also, and the actual review of our TSD approach, and the introduction, for instance, of sanctions and a much more strengthening of that chapter, we, and as I mentioned, you know, we thought, and we still think that we could very much develop the gender dimension of that within the TSD chapter. And if you look at, you know, the approach that we have taken in New Zealand, I think that's an example of how we would take it from here. I gather and I understand and I hear that, of course, this is for future FTAs, so you know, and that the question is, what do we do with the existing FTAs or FTAs like, for instance, Mercosur, where most of the negotiation is closed, and that's where the politics also get in, and where the political considerations need to be done at certainly at a higher pay grade level than me, and whether you know, what is the the approach and how, if it is considered important, for instance, by the EP, and I think you have put forward very clearly those considerations on your approach to Mexico, for instance, and your approach to Chile. You know, what are the options that we can do to still reflect in those agreements that are still not signed, and to highlight even more the gender dimension or TSD dimension. So that's what we are. And then there's the question of what to do with existing FTAs, and that's where the focus should definitely be more. And I'm talking here about FTAs that are not, at least don't have the prospect of being reopen in terms of future modernization, etc. So these are ongoing, and this is where we have to look into I would say more on the implementation of what we can do within the institutional framework that exists, how we can step up some of these issues, like for instance gender. I would also say that in conversations, when you think about why is more important SMEs than women, you can also think, well, obviously, when you're stepping up and trying to support SMEs and facilitate trade of SMEs, you're also helping indirectly as well, women and entrepreneurs who, I'm not the expert, I understand, very much our focus, or whose business are very much SMEs. So I think there's a debate out there, and I would only offer, by the way, our doors always open, and definitely, and I know you're always, at least from the European Parliament members, very much engaged in these conversations with the colleagues here in-house, and I will definitely pass on the message and reiterate your interest on that. Thank you.
No, I just want to say that you need Saskia's and Inma's, and that's why it's better to have a committee on trade and gender issues, because you have this committee concentrated on the gender and trade issues, and you don't get confused with the market access or sanitary or phytosanitary measures that sometimes are more pushed by the firms more than gender and trade issues. So if you have a committee on trade issue, on gender and trade, you have Saskia's, Carol's, Marta's working on it. So you need a specific trade committee on gender and trade issues.
Thanks, Dorothea. I think the message is very clear. Thanks for that. I will have to conclude here. There's one more question, but I'm sorry, Edme Dominguez, I will have to conclude. You're asking, one of the points that came from the presentations was the need of hard facts to monitor the effects of FTAs on women's situation. I think this is one of the recommendations we really take with us very much. Estelle also heard it, and it's coming back every time. Disaggregated gender data is key in order to monitor, to implement, to have a real inclusion of the gender dimension. And what are the prospects of including clauses of creating committees to create such facts in all FTAs? So yes, this is a very good question, and let's further work on that. And also about the human rights clauses, are there these still conditional clauses in all FTAs? This is also something we're really much working on from the European Parliament, because the human rights dimension is really missing currently in the TSD review. So this is definitely also something we need to work further on. The Ombudswoman also issued very good recommendations when it comes to including the human rights dimension in our FTAs. But this is another topic, even if it's of course very close to what we've discussed today. I would like to thank very much all the panelists, Carolina, Dorothea, Marta, Esther, also Inma, and I see you have put your email addresses, inviting the participants to contact you if they want to get in touch with you, and this is a very good idea. We'll definitely stay in touch. I would like to stress the fact that we are working also in INTA to reinforce and improve the sustainability impact assessments, including the gender dimension. But we insist really much that they would be ex ante, so before even to start negotiating, so that all the issues that might exist with a partner country we have to negotiate with are known and clearly put on the table when the negotiations start. I think it is key to prevent such situations as the one with EU-Mercosur to happen, that once it's concluded, once it's negotiated, we come with different elements that are really problematic in our view, and gender is part of them. So of course we also have to improve the TSD and gender dimension, which is still missing in existing FTAs and also already negotiated ones, such as the EU-Mercosur. And we really have a lot of expectations towards the Commission when it comes to the EU-Mercosur agreement. For us, renegotiating the deal is key if we want also the approval of the EU citizens to such trade agreements, and expect a positive impact on quality jobs for all, including for women. I think, and this will be my concluding word, that we urgently need an intersectional approach, as was mentioned by Carolina mainly. I think this is also very important because there are other vulnerable groups, and we know that if there are adverse effects on women, we also know in cascade we have also adverse impacts on children, for instance. And this is also something that we need to take with us. So thank you again. Sorry for pressing the time. It's always the part of the game. But I think it was a really rich discussion with many elements that will be useful to our work. So thank you for that. And we keep in touch. Thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.